I am a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world alone. Yet there's no sickness, no toil, no danger in this bright world to which I go. I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I know dark clouds will gather round me. I know my way, it's rough and steep, but beautiful fields lie just before me, where God's redeemed their vigils keep. So I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home.
For John, a poem from Scotland, read by Emma Leckie. Epitaph on a Friend by Robert Burns. An honest man here lies at rest, the friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age and guide of youth. Few hearts like his with virtue warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed. If there's another world, he lives in bliss. If there is none, he made the best of this.
I have to say, when we first thought about this event, there was one thing that I wanted to read, which is a few lines from Dante from La Vita Nuova. I'll say them. Piangete amante poiché piange amore, perché bell'ana morte ha miso il suo crudele ad operare in gentil cuore. Which means, and the Italian speakers will have had more difficulty than any of the rest of you, which means simply that cry, lovers, for love itself is crying, because wretched death has done its terrible work with a gentle heart. But then I thought again, we've had our time for crying, and there will be more time for crying as time goes on. What matters now is to celebrate the extraordinary life and the extraordinary career of John Alexander Holm. So that is what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to tell his story here. Let's begin at the beginning. John was born in the American Midwest, in Jackson, Michigan, which is a town that used to have industry in the old days and now only has prisons. Richard Johnson was at school with him.
I met John probably when I was around 8 years old. John would have been about 6. John and his family were very sophisticated in my view. This aspect drew me in because I sensed a broad picture of the world through their eyes. John and I would tell each other stories that we made up. These later became written versions. John's stories, I thought, were highly creative and tended to be futuristic. We discussed the world as it was unfolding before us. John's father had been in the Merchant Marine, and he had an almost insatiable appetite for travel. When I was about 12, the Holm family embarked on a series of lengthy summer trips that would last 3 to 4 weeks, from the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada to the American Southwest. John, on most days, would fill the back of a postcard with fine, dense printing, describing in much detail their progress. I would almost wait by the mailbox for them to arrive.
John never did stop travelling. In fact, he terrified his parents by hitchhiking to Nicaragua, where he heard for the first time about the pirate English of the Caribbean coast. And he came back, of course, to go on studying. Bobby Cohen remembers. Jenny?
I first met John in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan in freshman English seminar, which met on Saturday morning. Very sophisticated, just coming from high school. John was 18, I was 16. After our first writing assignment, Professor Gindon selected one student's work to show what good writing was. Of course, it was John's piece, a harbinger of things to come. Our friendship lasted across time and distance, bound by writing long handwritten letters. Mine from exotic places like Ann Arbor, Cleveland, New York. John's from far points north, south, and east. I still have a letter from a mutual friend, Judy Siff, circa 1964. She described being on the steps of American Express in Paris, opening a letter from me, with something of a Christmas morning feeling, having recently arrived and feeling rather lonesome. She looked up, and there in front of her was John, opening his letter from me. Neither had known the other was in Paris at that time. A big bear hug from John, and all was well. I do believe those old-fashioned letters we wrote, written on thin paper on both sides, a challenge to decipher, had powerful magic.
John went on to teach English in Colombia and Bogota, but also in Switzerland, but with a country which played a surprisingly strong role in his life, healing and consoling, and finally, at the end, stifling. Mario Pelli knows that time.
Estimados amigos do John e do Michael. O John e o Michael, ambos eles linguistas, embora de diferentes maneiras, ambos eminentes nos seus ramos, os dois com uma propensão à Suíça, aos Prealpes, onde o John ensinava o inglês e ainda conhecia o nosso dialeito arcaico, procurava de falar. É por isso que eu escrevi um texto rural para eles, simples, como são os próprios suíços. Conta o texto o que se passa num pasto com vacas e arcas, uma das quais morre e aquela que sobrevive quer continuar a sua vida habitual. O texto é dedicado ao John e ao Michael, que, se Deus quiser, esperamos ver muitas vezes no futuro, para mantermos a nossa amizade. Eis o texto. Me feita mit Rühr drauf, wo hatschet, Äpfel mantet, weil's Bäume hat dort mit Früchten dran. Ganz näher sind zwei, der eine prall, der andere nicht, Zerbelt schwer, hat kranke Gäste, wo modert. Gang noch nicht, sagt der Heim, besorgt. Doch dann passiert's, es knillt ihn ab, es bleibt ein Strunk. Der andere schaut ihn traurig an. Ja gut, ein Stück von ihm bleibt da. Das tun wir hätscheln, hüten, behalten. Und ich trage bei, blühe kräftig weiter, trage meine Früchte für ihn und mich.
John got to New York City a long time before I did. He got his degree in teaching English as a foreign language at Columbia, but he also, which is very important, earned money as a social worker. He saw a lot of problems he couldn't solve, and he learned a science that he thought in the end might help enormously. Studying language, insisting on respect for anyone's language. In 1975 we met in a London steam bath. John always loved telling that story. And he pulled out of a Heidelberg PhD in order to study at UCL in London. He wrote about that pirate English of Nicaragua, and he did so with Dick Hudson as his supervisor.
John came to me in 1975 in search of a PhD supervisor. My first impression was of someone who didn't fit any moral stereotypes, a very gentle and very modest fighter and intellectual. I soon discovered that he was a fighter because he told me how he had fought for the disadvantaged students that he had been teaching in New York. And then he told me how he had traveled through Central America with his guitar and not much else. And he was clearly an intellectual because the thing that had grabbed his attention in Central America wasn't the usual tourist stuff, but the language of the people he had met in blue fields on the coast of Nicaragua, an English-based Creole. I think this may have been his first encounter with a Creole, and he was hooked for life. What he wanted to do was to go back to Bluefields to study this odd language. Once UCL had given him a precious few tools for the job, he headed off into the unknown and came back a year later with a mass of data, undiminished enthusiasm for analysis and publication, and a wealth of fascinating facts about exotic places, such as the one where they spoke Creole English with a German accent, learned from German missionaries who happened to have landed there, or the one where men and women spoke differently, because some generations back an invasion had wiped out all the males. He was one of those rare PhD students who don't really need a supervisor and who end up teaching their supervisor more than they are taught. I feel very privileged to have been part of his professional training and to claim a tiny share in the subsequent glory of his academic career. But I also feel privileged to have known such a warm, interesting, interested and generous person. John was one of the most impressive academics I've ever met, and turned Pidgin-Creole studies into a really respectable subfield. And he had an astonishing capacity for absorbing facts and learning languages. But he was such a nice, modest guy without any pretensions at all. One action sticks in my mind as particularly characteristic. He knew I was trying to learn the guitar, so when he was packing up to leave London after his PhD, he handed me the one that had gone to Central America with him. He was equally generous in everything he did, and the world is a better place for his life.
After London, John taught for a couple of years in the Bahamas and co-wrote a dictionary of Bahamian English. Now, it is no fun to live in a tax haven until you have the income, and we didn't, so we moved on to New York. John taught developmental English for a while he was working on his 2-volume CUP Green Series book on Pigeons and Creoles. Vanya Peña-Lopez remembers.
John had an uncanny ability to cultivate friends the world over. We met in New York shortly after I arrived there for a year of study, which turned out to be a lifetime. We bonded over our mutual love of languages, books, and food. He told me about pigeons and creoles. He taught me how to cook a Thanksgiving turkey, the recipe for which I keep tucked in the copy of The Joy of Cooking he gave to me. I attended his celebration of tenure and even brought a dish, bolinhos de atum. Remember, Michael? Memorable were the Christmas dinners where the goose and the pudding that Michael cooked, and we all applauded. Delicious were John's apple and peach pies at the end of Sunday supper. Many of John's and Michael's works, as well as my own, were discussed during glorious meals. John even baked my wedding cake. It's not his fault that the marriage ended.
John also started to teach at the CUNY Graduate Centre, which in a way is where this story begins all over again. John and his graduate students. Gerardo Lorenzino was one of them.
John was my dissertation advisor at the graduate school, CUNY, City University, New York. He was the only CUNY faculty to congratulate me about my acceptance to the program. I still have the letter. I was 29 years old, having spent the previous 12 years studying chemistry and working in a chemical lab, albeit one whose predisposition for study of mixtures made the transition easier. John allowed me to find content or happiness in pursuing what one enjoys most, whatever other people say. In January 1992, we went to a conference in Santiago de Cuba. Given my fluency in Spanish, John told me that I would be in charge once we arrived in Cuba. Well, it took me no time to realize that once landed in Havana, that all I had to do was relax and let John be himself. There were unforgettable moments in that trip, as when John danced on the stage in a Copacabana show with a scantily dressed woman dancer. But more importantly, those 10 days John and I shared were precious moments to seek and hear his advice, and at a more personal level, regain confidence and do away with my insecurities for what lay ahead in my academic future. I have kept John's correspondence from pre-email times, including his always kind and encouraging comments and meticulous revisions to many of my graduate papers, chapter dissertations, article drafts, long letters, short notes, faxes, and postcards he sent me from all continents. John's comments, I like to plagiarize the most of my students' writings, are here. You're a linguist, but without your meal ticket, the PhD, on PhD level work by students who haven't completed their dissertation yet. 2, this still has a faint smell of bullshit about it.
Kate Green Vichard was this, who also wrote her PhD with John at the Graduate Centre.
John, I want you to know that I would not be where I am now if it were not for you. You were a 1 in a million thesis advisor, and I suspect many, all, of your graduate students feel the same way. I recall you described yourself as the mother hen for your students. Well, I know that I would never have gotten my PhD without your mother henning me. You pushed me out of my comfort zone so many times, and you were always right to do so, because in the end I succeeded. Nowadays, when students come to see me, I try to push them out of their comfort zone, and they are always grateful. I am simply passing on what was done to me. John, this is the best way I can honor you. John and Michael, you made a beautiful couple, 2 highly creative people who thrive individually in your careers as well as together. Your love, respect, and support for each other is something we should all aspire to. I am blessed to have had you both in my life.
In the horror of the AIDS epidemic of the early 1980s in New York, John had to mentor and nurture in quite other ways. Ana Celia Zentea was a colleague at the time.
John's mentoring is legendary, but I must make special note of the guidance and support he provided to José Vigo, a Puerto Rican-born graduate of Hunter College, where John and I were professors. José was working on a sociolinguistic study of Samaná, Dominican Republic, the language of descendants of a 19th century colony of freed American slaves, for a PhD at Yale, while fighting a losing battle with AIDS. John helped José with his life and his death. He even organized his papers for the Schomburg Library in New York City, where they may be consulted. I remember Gentle John as a brilliant scholar and a warm and generous person. Fue una verdadera bendición poder conocerlo.
I also remember days on the AIDS ward when we cleaned up after José because the nurses, all in spacesuits and hoods and masks, were too terrified to touch anything at all. And I remember John's steadfast care during those times. It also touched his other Puerto Rican colleague, Yolanda Rivera Castillo, who sent this poem.
It is that space behind the given and the taken that opens a ruddy pain around my eyes. It is the memory of words, the remembrance of papers lightly touched by your swarming hands. It is ignoring if your gentle body will visit the voice of those who recall the sound of water in your front yard. But there is an abyss, a simple void, that remembers a smile that jumped over the sorrow, a force that travelled with you everywhere, and now will stay with us in this season of absence.
John and I somehow acquired 100 unofficial godchildren. They were old enough to choose us. And John does have one official church godson called Ricky Brackett. His family are from Nicaragua, from Pirate English territory. And his imperfect English almost consigned him to special education in New York. That is to say, education for the educationally subnormal. John did not leave him there.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My godfather is an amazing godfather, no matter where he is. I'm sorry that I won't be able to make it to Portugal to celebrate his life because of school. A year from now, I will receive my master's degree in taxation, and you would not want anything less from me. I know he is proud of me now and looking down on his loved ones. I don't see color. I see my godfather, who has treated myself and my mom and my brother like his family. He is a friend, a husband, a mentor, a teacher, and most importantly, a godfather. He will be missed by many, but will be remembered by plenty. I won't say goodbye, but I will say, see you later. God bless to all. Ricky.
This poem is by Bernardino Cardoso Tavares, for whom John fought as he fought for so many of his students. Bernardino is reading it.
You are far away, but you are close. You made your way, but you showed me the way I'm walking. Every day, your will was to stay with us. You are, and you will go on, here in our hearts, forever, John. You moved, and we all lost, but let's see your list, and keep doing always as you did. So many good times in a good mood.
All of this time, John's academic reputation was growing, although it has to be said at one point, CUNY charged him with the high crime of doing research and tried to deny him tenure. He virtually defined Creole studies and set its agenda in one book, in 2 volumes, but only one book. And there was no divide at all between his life and his work. Alain Keane from CNRS in Paris says,
Do you know what a meatloaf is? It's an American delicacy made of ground beef, breadcrumbs, onions, Worcestershire sauce, and more, everything mixed and cooked in the oven. It was in the 80s. My wife, Liliane, and I were in New York City, and we were invited for dinner at his place. He had cooked a meatloaf. The meatloaf was delicious. John was a delicious man. All the kindness of his soul was expressed in this dish. He was a man who could cry when telling how an African student of his had been insulted and spat upon by racist punks in a street in Coimbra. At the same time, he would apologize for maybe embarrassing you with such a show of emotion. But no, you loved him more for those tears. John was a Creolist. I am one too, so I must say how grateful I am to him for continuously producing solid scholarly work during all the years when so much time was lost discussing theories that should never have been taken seriously, given their near lack of empirical foundation. John was not trendy. Some looked down on him for that. Their work will be mere history when his will still be useful to generations of students. Dear John, you'll be with Liliana and me for as long as we live.
Peter Meiskin, who once held the first chair of Creole studies in Europe at Leiden, remembers this.
Creole studies has, alas, for a long time been an academic field full of ad personam attacks and strife, the reason why I stepped away from the field for a bit. Over the years, monogeneticists crossed swords with polygeneticists. Proponents of the language bioprogram attacked people with a more historical perspective. Universalists clashed with substratists and variationists with grammarians. Now, proponents of the social ecology perspective are at daggers drawn with the radical typologists. In this melee, John was a kind and honest man, fair to his colleagues, meticulous in his scholarship, generous in his praise of others, also younger scholars, balanced in his views, and fully cognizant of academic courtesy. His work left a solid foundation for others to build on and interact with.
So many colleagues remember particular things about John as well as the general. This is Malis Baptista from the University of Michigan.
It is a tautology to state that academics love books and have an insatiable thirst for knowledge, but rarely have I met someone more passionate about books than John was. The Society of Pidgin and Creole Linguistics conducts book auctions at its conference dinner yearly, and whenever John was present, all in the room knew that it was futile to compete with John, as he would outbid every one of us and infallibly offer the highest possible price for the book that was still missing from his collection. Such a passion for books turned him into the erudite he was, and whose knowledge of the field we all benefited from.
And this is from Anthony Grant at Edge Hill University.
It was always good to be around John at a Creolistics conference, to hear ideas and anecdotes in an ambiance of good humor and intellectual curiosity. And he seemed to be at ease everywhere. I remember being in Accra with him. We walked off the campus of the University of Ghana, and not 10 meters away, there was a small market. We looked at the produce, and John picked up some squat and unattractive bananas. They call these sweet bananas in the Bahamas, he told me. I think I'll get one for myself. I followed his lead, and I was glad I did. They may have been about half the length of the usual kind of bananas, but they were deliciously sweet and served as a great snack for the next few days.
And Peter Backer from our house even remembers those days when John became just famous enough for rumours to start going about.
A colleague once called him a friendly bear, and he was indeed a good man. Many years ago, there were rumors that John had died. And I phoned New York. Yes, it was that long ago. And I was so glad that John answered the phone. He mentioned, with his humor, that he was perhaps confused with a porn star with a similar name who had died.
I have to say, that was a standing joke at CUNY. His students added a line under his name on the door, "Every inch a star." More seriously, Emmanuel Chan from Orléans. I'm going to read this one. John Holm fait partie de ces rares personnes qui rendent leur passion contagieuse. Impossible à quiconque l'ayant écouté lors de ses conférences de ne pas être à son tour emporté par son enthousiasme et sa passion pour les langues créoles. Ses remarques pertinentes et son rire manqueront à nos conférences. And Hilda de Corto in Brasilia, with whom John helped found the journal Papia, says this.
He was the most enthusiastic Creolist I've ever seen. He was always ready to share information. If he knew of somebody in Indonesia who needed information that somebody else in China had, he immediately put them in contact.
And as Anastasia Centella notes,
John was one of the few linguists who actually spoke other languages. As a Puerto Rican, I very much appreciated his knowledge of and respect for our Spanish and that of Dominicans, Colombians, Italian.
John had friends everywhere he cared about the language, which was just about everywhere. This is from our friend Janina Rabinovitz.
Sweet remembrance. Deep in the Suriname rainforest, I was living with Nuchican Maroons in the remote village at Ritabeche for an almost 10-week stretch, speaking only their language, when it was time for me to return to the USA. My gear was packed into a canoe, and my boatman and I made a 5-hour trip northwards on the Tapanahoni River to Stoneman's Island, where I would pick up a twin otter plane to return to Paramaribo. Sorry about it. It was a heavy tropical morning, made comfortable by the breeze of the boat moving quickly. We started out early to be sure to have plenty of time to catch their plane. As we approached Stoneman's Island, I saw 2 white men sitting on the dock, staring at our approaching canoe. And as we came close, one of us yelled, "Hi!" I can't remember which. After 10 weeks of not having English in my mouth, I was overjoyed at the thought of being able to express myself once again with a vocabulary appropriate to my age level. And thus began my friendship with John Holm and Michael Pye. I nearly talked them to death before our plane arrived. What a wonderful meeting it was. That was the beginning of a 40-year relationship spread over 3 continents. John was a beloved and beautiful man. Beyond that, there was a wholesomeness of spirit that he had. And I think that John Holm made people feel very good. He was with us fully when we were together. What greater skill is there, after all?
To begin with, we came to Portugal only in the summers, and one of our many honorary godchildren, Wesley van den Bos, remembers.
When I was 11 years old, my parents took me on the first ever summer holiday to Portugal. Being born in the summer, my 12th birthday was the first ever memory I have of John and Michael. At that time, I received a scent of Calvin Klein, very trendy in the 90s. And John was wondering why a heterosexual guy would want that, while Calvin Klein was only for gays, right? He didn't know how very right he was. During the years, we each year visited Portugal, and each year we met John and Michael. They even were our neighbors for a little while. They became part of the family, and I felt like having 2 new friends and dads. Growing up and getting my own family of kids, they were always there, either in Portugal or on visits in Holland. And we always met up, eating good food, having great conversations, and enjoying the bickering of those loving 2 men. At 30, I ended my relationship and had my coming out. I went to Portugal alone that year and had the most memorable conversation in our garden with John. I will never forget his support and love during that meeting. He showed me what a brave and great step it had been and told me his own story. That, for me, was the love I needed at that exact moment. The last years, we continued our great meetings up, and now with my boyfriend and the kids. Even in the last years, we had so much fun together. John, I am gonna miss you tremendously and will never forget you. And don't worry, I'll take care of Michael in Holland for you.
Actually, Wesley is taking me on my first trip to IKEA next week, which I'm not sure is really looking after me, but never mind. When John first came to Coimbra, he came as a Fulbright scholar, and then as a professor convidado. At first we thought being confidante was really rather good. But then I had to pay John's salary for the first 6 months because the university forgot, as they also forgot about his work papers. Never mind. Dominicus Volkim was one of his first generation students.
I met John Holm in October 1998. I was 26, recently married, and I had just arrived to Coimbra from the Açores. My Portuguese was at the lower intermediate level, and I was quite lost. I had read John's course syllabus on pidgins and creoles and thought, that's pretty crazy stuff. But because I knew the lectures would be in English, which would give me equal chances in a 100% Portuguese native speaker group, I went for it. There he was, a traditional professor in an old-fashioned brown tweed jacket and with a leather briefcase. In that class, he talked passionately about the beginning of the study of linguistics in ancient Greece. I loved him, and I knew instantly I was facing a true master. I went back home, straight to the internet, and checked his publications on Amazon. I was bewildered that somebody so internationally famous was actually teaching us, undergraduates, at Coimbra's Faculty of Letters. I bought his Pidgins and Creoles, and on the 17th of December 1998, asked him to sign the book. He wrote, "For Dominica, my star." He never stopped believing in me since then. Most of my memories of him are very funny. We flew to Munich in November 2004 for a conference, and on the plane, we both talked loudly and of course non-stop. John had that deep and clear teacher's voice about virtually everybody within the Creole field. There were only few people on that flight, and an irritated German passenger who was trying to read newspaper complained. John stood up very upset and said, "Come on, Dominica, put on your parachute. We are being expelled from the plane for talking." Later, while we were waiting for our suitcases among dead silent travelers, such a contrast from Lisbon, John could not restrain himself from making very loud comments about the popularity of Hitler in Munich. Then he rolled his suitcase furiously to the entrance. John made me discover linguistics and science in a broader sense, and thanks to him, I found Cape Verde and came to live and work here, shifting away from my Eurocentric point of view and finding some meaning in life. John was the person I wanted my father to be.
At Coimbra, he shared his office with Clara Keating.
Objects and things take us into surprising flashes of memory, unspoken desires of different futures. John's objects in his office could lead us into this journey. A poster of Taking Lives with Angelina Jolie at her best, the sociolinguistics poster on Creole hip-hop in Germany, a grey blanket and a pillow for John's after-lunch nap. It was absolutely verboten to enter the room between 1 and 2. I witnessed the striking transformations that many wayfaring students' failed perceptions of themselves. They entered as wrongdoers of language, with self-perceptions of their repertoires as non-standard, erratic, deformed, and left the room as dignified native speakers and successful linguists, authorities in the forms and varieties of rare, beautiful existence. All these being performed by light laughs, humour, detailed, non-stop editing support, a bear-like body dressed in a used, comfortable tweed jacket. John left the best desk by the window for me. I was lucky to be there in the odd moment as John engaged in student supervision. The warm rays of light during the summer days in June entered the window, passed through me, and were projected onto the students as John mothered them, or him or her, throughout the exploration of linguistic form and grammar in the light of the students' lived experience of language. O professor americano, as some of the cleaning ladies in the corridor used to call him.
Stephen Wilson remembers.
John Holm was my colleague in Anglo-American Studies, an invaluable, valued, and much missed colleague, missed in his retirement and missed all the more since his retirement has been cruelly cut short. We worked in widely different fields, but were near neighbours on the 6th floor of the faculty. For near enough 2 decades, we passed the time of day, exchanged ideas, opinions, and gossip, shared the odd cup of coffee, and even occasionally worked together. I should also mention the bags of garden produce, giant courgettes, that John would bestow on us from time to time. John was a great teacher and scholar. I can testify to the former on the basis of the number of exchange students that I inflicted on him, who came to regard John's linguistics classes as the highlight of their period of study in Coimbra. I would not presume to comment on John's scholarly work. W.H. Auden wrote that time forgives all by whom language lives. John was one of those by whom language lives, but I do not know of anything for which he needed to be forgiven. He was a good man, a man distinguished by what I would call a vernacular goodness, a goodness that was a daily, unostentatious practice. It is better to say that time will bless and honour him, and as best I can, I do that here.
Martin, would you read the poem?
After all.
After all, I think, yes. Martin Earle spent quite a lot of time with John in the last days of his rather long illness.
They were days when his mind was altering somewhat, as happens, but the conversation was no less interesting. The poem is called A Light Blue Grammar. In our last conversations, you were clearly working on several new theories which concerned the Creole of the nearly dying, derived as it was from the pigeons of purgatory and the voices of circling souls, the purging bathers. And towards the end, you had latched onto a radical notion that threatened to upend current theory. You were convinced that earthly scholars had misconstrued the relation between substrate and superstrate, principally their relative prestige, and that you'd spent your life laboring under this basic misunderstanding. The new dispensation you named a light blue grammar. The field work was obviously treacherous and frightening, and mostly you labored with your eyes closed, opening them occasionally to release a flood of tears before returning to your research. I asked you if somehow God fit into your new thinking, and you replied, He's in charge of the little things, like ensuring the flow of urine from the catheter into the bag at my feet. At which point, we both looked down at the bag, as though to confirm that God's work was indeed being done. Of course, you spoke of much else besides linguistics. You'd always been hesitant about talking shop, defaulting to concerns for family life and relationships, the parameters of dread, and how exile becomes home over time. And then, inevitably, you'd return to your work on the light blue grammar. You spoke of how utterly our earthly Lexis is influenced by the loan words of the archangels, citing by example Gabriel's work on the planet Saturn's photochemical cycle and how that played out in the cabbage patch beyond your office window. You interspersed your English with the new language you were struggling to learn. It sounded like a cross between Ningatu and the so-called good language encountered by the Jesuits in northern Brazil, and Aramaic, the language of Jesus. I put my ear close to your mouth as you cited rule number 1 of the light blue grammar. Love is a recursively enumerable subset in the set of all possible emotions. From love comes the alphabet of our being.
This is from Olga Solovova, another one of John's first generation of students at Coimbra.
John was the man responsible for introducing me into the world of academia. He believed in me and led me by the hand. He has always been very attentive, patient, and respectful to my work. Everything I know, I owe it to John, the scholar, the teacher, the professor, the linguist. Yet he was also the most humane and generous person I have ever met. Last time I've seen him was in Continent in Coimbra shopping with Vanya, his nurse. They had come shopping for things for Michael's birthday. I was there with my Russian friend, and there, in between helping them to find lamb chops, I remember him say to my friend and me, "Doctors say I should have died 7 months ago. Yet here I am." He cracked a smile. We all laughed to stifle the knot in our throats.
All too soon we were reading the obituaries. Our old friend Nick Faith did. He said, "Until I read the obituary, I hadn't realized that he had, in effect, created a whole new subject by putting local languages in their proper predominant place in relation to their European and imperialist equivalents." But so too did our unofficial niece, Renata Teixeira.
I've read the New York Times article about Uncle John. It was beautiful. However, it did not begin to cover the amazing uncle he was. Uncle John was funny, cute, and always interested in what I had to say and in what I was interested in at the moment. He knew so much about so many things. He had so many stories. I can still see his suspenders, his professorial fashion, and the way he fixed his huge glasses. It warms my heart. I always thought he was fascinating, I still do. John was my uncle, not by blood, but by heart. He was the kind of person that you don't know at all, and then bang, next day is family.
There was no gap between the life and the work. Patricia Guerrini-Schafer.
I'm reading this in the name of some of Professor Holm's last supervisees, the one who have worked with him during the last 7 years. As the worldwide community of linguists knows, John's cause was very appealing for people interested in the politics behind the status of languages, and especially for speakers or students of underprivileged, even disrespected languages who realized they could use their access to graduate education to help improve the status of these languages by taking them seriously and studying them. It was a useful change from studying the languages of European powers and great empires. Besides the acknowledged social importance of Professor Holm's academic work, for us it is also important to remember his efforts to integrate his students in the academic environment, for promoting an international feeling of mutual support among his students, for being accessible and patient in our every doubt, for kindly encouraging us to borrow books from his personal library, and for providing the perfect workplace and environment for postgraduate students. It is true that we, his former supervisors, adored him, and it was impossible not to. He has changed the lives of many of us through his kindness and generosity. John saw people's potential and helped the way he could to see us in our best. And why? We guess he just really liked to see people excel, and for that, we wish the world was a lot more like John.
We're going to finish with a poem by Norman MacKay, It's a poem that our old friend Linda Mouth would have liked to be here to read, but I'm grateful that Adriana is reading it for us.
He went through a company like a lamplighter. See the dull minds, one after another, begin to glow, to shed a beneficent light. He went through a company like a knife grinder, seeing the dull minds, scattering sparks of themselves, becoming razory, becoming useful. He went through a company as himself. But now, he is one of the multitudinous company of the dead, where are no individuals. The beneficent lights dim and don't vanish. The razory edges dull, but still cut. He's gone, but you can see his tracks still in the snow of the world.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world alone. Yet there's no sickness, no toil, no danger in this bright world to which I go. I'm going there to see my mother. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. And no dark clouds will gather around me. I know my way, it's rough and steep, a beautiful field lie just before me, where God's redeemed their vigils keep, and I'm going there to see my Father. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to come over to the Faculty of Letters for a drink? I think we may need one. And can I thank the Biblioteca Geral and the Faculdade de Letras for all their help in organising this event. We'll see you across the road.